Everybody knows about February's horrific earthquake in Turkey and Syria. But did you hear about the city of Erzin? It was a stability oasis in a desert of devastation. The city of 20,000 in southern Turkey suffered no deaths, and not a single building collapsed during the epic quake, which turned the surrounding area into a tomb of concrete, burying more than 40,000 people. Officials and residents say there are 3 reasons Erzin escaped the widespread destruction. But to understand them, we have to know something about the region. And bear with me here, because this will set up some powerful spiritual applications. The Earth's crust is incredibly unstable in this part of the world because 2 tectonic plates meet right in front of the Turkish capital of Istanbul, home to 15 million people. Usually, these massive slabs of rock push past each other bit by bit, but in what's called the fault zone, the plates get stuck, creating massive friction. And in areas where the plates can't move alongside each other, the pressure builds until something blows, touching off an explosive upheaval that we call an earthquake. According to experts, the Turkish quake released pressure that built up over 400 years, blasting out with the same intensity as the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state. And there is personal application number 1. If we refuse to address festering conflict and unresolved anger, we're just setting ourselves up for disaster. Because when we suppress or repress our frustration with others, it's only a matter of time before the pressure gets to be too much and something blows, always with terrible consequences for ourselves and those around us. That's why the Apostle Paul writes, "Let's tell our neighbors the truth, for we're all parts of the same body. And don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil." In other words, deal with your anger right away, so it doesn't deal with you. And Paul adds, always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God has forgiven you. So don't let things build up, and stay humble, especially when you're angry. And as Paul has already said in verse 15, speak the truth in love, growing in every way more like Christ, who is the head of the church. Yes, speak the truth in love, but speak it. Humility and gentleness don't mean burying your anger. It's worth noting that all of us have fault lines in our relationships, areas of friction where pressure is most likely to build up. Do you know what yours are? If not, ask God to show you where you're most vulnerable to things like pride, impatience, insecurity, or the need for approval. Ask Him to help you work through past hurts or current frustrations so you can move alongside even the most difficult people in your life without getting stuck. Okay, back to Erzin. The first reason the city was able to withstand the quake better than most is because of its foundation. The city is built on hard ground with ultra-thick bedrock and soil with coarser grains than sand. So the foundation and the hard soil act as a shock absorber that reduces the sway of buildings on the surface. But surrounding cities and villages are built upon the layers of sand, silt, and clay of an ancient riverbed. That soft, waterlogged sediment makes those places much more susceptible to earthquakes, which make them move like a wave. Of course, it all brings to mind the words of Jesus in Matthew 10.
Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash.
Along with its firm foundation, Erzin was also saved by compliance with construction standards that followed the latest seismic codes. Unlike most of its neighbors, the city made developers follow regulations, and those regulations were based on Turkey's experience with a 1999 earthquake that killed more than 17,000 people. But although that disaster pushed the government to revise building codes, the new standards weren't widely enforced because of payoffs and corruption. Not only that, existing buildings were exempted from the new rules if the owners paid a heavy fine to the government. So, lots of builders continued to use cheap materials to increase profit, and many were inexperienced and uneducated when it came to regulations like the seismic code for strong foundations. Back in Ephesians 4, Paul has some advice on the code by which we must build our lives. After talking about the role played by pastors, teachers, and others, he says, their responsibility is to equip God's people to do His work and build up the church. This will continue until we all come to such unity in our faith and knowledge of God's Son that we will be mature in the Lord, measuring up to the full and complete standard of Christ. Then we won't be tossed and blown about by every new teaching. We won't be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. Instead, we will grow in every way more and more like Christ. He makes everything fit together perfectly. As each of us does our own special work, it helps the others grow, so the whole church is healthy and growing and full of love. So using Jesus as the standard for our attitudes and behavior leads to unity, maturity, stability, and responsibility. When you look at it that way, it's no wonder the lives of so many people around us are reduced to rubble. They don't follow the standard of the greatest designer of all time. They often cut corners when it comes to moral and ethical decisions, and they'd much sooner keep their lives the way they are rather than pay the cost required to make improvements that would keep themselves and their loved ones safe. Even when they've been through situations that shook their lives to the very foundation, many insist on staying right where they are. And when the next emotional quake hits, they suffer the consequences all over again. Let me show you how and why that happens using the Turkish situation as an illustration. The bottom floor crumbles, then the rest of the building falls on top of it in what's known as a pancake collapse. Thousands of buildings in Turkey and Syria tumbled straight down in a similar way, which isn't surprising considering the intensity of the two earthquakes. But it's the pancake collapses that made this event one of the most deadly in the region. When you look at the areas hardest hit, you see they're densely populated, filled with refugees from Syria's civil war who lived in buildings built haphazardly. And across the border in Syria itself, many structures were already weakened by shelling and explosions. Even so, Turkey was well aware of its most vulnerable buildings, called soft story structures. These are almost always several floors high, with an open plan on the bottom. That open space is often used for parking, or a place for small businesses, or to accommodate extra people. Soft story buildings are common around the world, but especially in India, Pakistan, and Turkey. But they're extremely vulnerable to earthquakes, and that's because the lower columns are often made of brittle concrete, while the upper stories are usually constructed out of better concrete and stone, which is heavier. Sometimes the bottom floor has fewer walls than the ones above, with sides that are left open or columns that aren't attached to walls. That means the soft story is the weakest floor and can't fully support the heavier ones above it. So when an earthquake hits, the building shakes until the bottom floor collapses and the upper floors eventually pancake right into it. That's when people get trapped under tons of debris, making rescue difficult. So not only do we need to build our lives on the right foundation, using the right standard, we have to make sure we're fully grounded with the strong supports we need to make sure we won't collapse every time we're shaken. If Jesus is our bedrock, and the Bible reflects the standard of his character and conduct, the church is our support columns, through which God supplies the strength and stability we need so that we're not going to see everything we built come tumbling down every time the emotional ground gives out from under us. Now here's the thing. Soft story buildings can be strengthened by replacing flimsy columns or using steel frames to reinforce them. Open walls can be reinforced too, and extra bolts or braces can be drilled into the foundation so that if the structure shakes, there's support from the bottom floor. The solutions are simple, but they're extremely costly. According to the World Bank, Turkey has almost 7 million homes that need reinforcement, which would cost $465 billion. So, as of a couple of years ago, only 4% of the affected buildings were made safer and more stable. It reminds me that, as I said earlier, many people, including some Christians, find the price of following Jesus too high. In a world where most settle for what's quick and comfortable, a call to service and sacrifice doesn't hold a whole lot of attraction. And even when people can see the clear benefits of faith, they often focus on the price they'd have to pay and take a pass.
Brothers and sisters.
Ironically, they're obeying Jesus in one respect. In Luke 14, he tells potential followers they must count the cost of full commitment to him, and he uses a construction analogy to make his point.
Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples.
When Jesus says we have to hate our father or mother, it's only to emphasize how much more we have to be willing to put him first, above everyone and everything. Otherwise, we're as useless as salt that loses its saltiness.
Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.
And picking up our cross is a metaphor for sacrifice and death of self. We have to be willing to give God our priorities, preferences, and our pursuits. And that means letting him have control of everything: our time, talent, energy, and money. Otherwise, when people see our mediocre, wishy-washy response, we will bring ridicule on ourselves and disdain upon the church. No wonder Jesus seems to imply that he'd rather have us reject him than embrace him but refuse to follow him. So it begs the question, what do you still have to give up to be all that Jesus wants? Because when people around us are metaphorically shaken to the core and sifting through the debris of their broken lives, our sacrifice is the most powerful testimony to the love and power of God. In the aftermath of the earthquake, the news was filled with stories of people who gave and did everything they could to help the stricken. And sometimes the church was right in the middle of it. In Turkey, Christians are a tiny minority. But look at this.
The ancient Mor Petrus and Mor Paulus church was the only functioning church in Adıyaman. However, due to the earthquakes, it has now been left partially destroyed.
Deprem akşamında Adıyaman Kilisesi'nde görev yapan insanlarımız ve çarşıda yaşayan ailelerimiz Bu aileler yaklaşık beraber 11 aile olarak hepsi kilisenin binasına sığınmak ve orada kendilerini güvene almak zorunda kaldılar. Ailelerimiz 2-3-4 güne kadar her akşam burada kilisede, karanlıkta ve mumların eşliğinde birbirlerine yardımcı olarak acılarını paylaştılar.
The Assyrian Christian community, which had been living in the area for hundreds of years, is a small but tight-knit community. 5 of them lost their lives in the earthquakes that hit the region, and the rest have had to temporarily migrate to other parts of Turkey.
And our church needs to be a place of safety and refuge when people are scared, hurting, and in need of support, whether it's material, emotional, or spiritual support. As a matter of fact, we need to be just like Erzin. Right after the earthquake, 20,000 people flocked there, doubling the city's population. Those fearing aftershocks felt safer there because of all the factors I've talked about. And because Erzin's roads were still intact, the center became a collection and distribution point for donations, such as food and clothing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could show our friends and relatives that real safety, security, and stability are found in God, and that His church is an oasis in the desert of devastation, just like Erzin? Well, we can, if we have the right foundation, the right standard, and the right supports. But that will take sacrificial love and commitment from all of us. If we embrace that vision and live an active, dynamic faith, we'll never be standing still. But no matter what happens, we'll still be standing.